Okay, so we are live. So hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for the latest peer-to-peer hangout. Today's topic is training staff and volunteers to lead inquiry-based gallery experiences. This is a reading resources virtual book swap where we're going to talk about some of those different resources. So I just want to welcome you. So these peer-to-peer hangouts are organized by the National Art Education Association Museum Education Division, which is a very big mouthful, so thank you for joining us. You do not need to be a member of NAEA to join us. Today we are joined by, there are 5 of us that are participating live via video and audio, but we have an unlimited number of participants who can watch and contribute your ideas by typing in questions or comments in the box just below this video that says Q&A. So like I said, you can type in a question, you can make a comment. Each of the speakers is going to share a couple different ideas and resources that they use, and as we go along, you can type in those questions or share similar resources that you think are also helpful. About midway through the Hangout, I'm going to post to our event page here the link to a shared Google document where we would love to get feedback from all of you. We already will feature the list of resources that this group has put together, but we'd love to have it be a living document that many others can share and contribute to that as we go along. And I just wanted to point out that this is one of 2 ways that the National Art Education Association's Museum Education Division is looking to connect colleagues together. This is our example of how we do that online through monthly Google Plus Hangouts that always take place on the 2nd Wednesday of each month at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We also, coming up in March, will be able to connect in person where we have our annual convention in New Orleans, March 26th through the 28th. And then while we're there, we also have a pre-conference on Wednesday, March 25th. And then we also will do a peer-to-peer hangout, peer-to-peer happy hour on Friday, March 27th. So I'll follow up with various listservs or on our Google Plus page with that information. So that is my beginning intro to get all of the business done. But we hope that we thank you all for joining us today and hope that you will contribute your ideas and questions. So I'm going to turn it over to David Bowles from the Metropolitan Museum to take us away.
Sure. Thank you, Michelle. And hi, everybody. I'm so glad you're joining us. As you know, today's goal, we've got a couple of goals, but one of them is to think about the reading resources that we use to train others to use inquiry. And I feel like we've tried a couple different names for the session, and we sacrificed brevity for clarity. We have this really long name now, but our big goal today is to just think about the different ways we use these resources. My name, as you know, is David Bowles. I am the Assistant Museum Educator for School Programs at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. And I train, support, and evaluate about 125 volunteers who lead school tours throughout the academic year, and also about 25 paid contractual educators who supplement that work, as well as a group of graduate interns. I've been doing this work now I've been here for about 2 years. Before that, I was at the Rubin Museum of Art, which is a museum of art from Himalayan Asia doing similar work, helping people help K-12 students connect to works of art. And throughout the process, I've really been thinking a lot about how we share expertise from the field with newcomers, to people who are learning inquiry for the first time, or perhaps people who are dusting off their inquiry toolbox. So that's kind of where the idea for this session came from. Let's see. Oh, and our sort of first guiding question that I'm gonna ask our panel to address as they talk about who they are is why do we use readings as training resources at all? That certainly could keep us busy for the whole session. I'll lob out my short answer that it's a great way to bring in new voices. That I can say something over and over again, but it's wonderful to read somebody else saying it in a different way. There's no one way to do that, but that's one advantage of using reading resources as a training tool. And I'll invite the rest of our panel to introduce themselves and tell you a little bit about who they are and where they're coming from. Why don't we start with you, Rebecca?
Great. All right, I'm still adjusting to this brand new technology. My name is Rebecca Hers, and I worked in art museums in New York for 15 years. I worked at the Noguchi Museum and before that the Guggenheim Museum. But I'm actually now, as of last week, in a new role, which is director of a children's museum called the Peoria Playhouse Children's Museum. You can see the funny little dancing house on my logo. If anybody has resources about early childhood and play, I will encourage you to send them my way. However, for the purposes of this webinar, in the art museum context, I trained teaching artists who worked in schools, paid museum educators, and then a variety of volunteer staff and interns. And certainly I believe that anyone who's working with programs in any way should engage with meaningful professional development, both through things like what we're doing right now, but also in-house, reading, discussing, and also classroom teachers. And as for the question, why use readings, I want to note that as I thought about that question, I asked a couple of educators who I had worked with that question, so thank you to Shannon Murphy and Lynette Palmer for answering this question, or helping me answer this question. To reiterate what David said, certainly it adds other voices to the conversation, and sometimes through readings I bring in voices that I am not sure I agree with, or statements I'm not sure I agree with through readings, and then that's a wonderful way to bring up ideas. Sometimes they end up changing my mind. Readings are often much more coherent than I can be speaking in the moment. These authors have spent a lot of time thinking about how to say what they want to say. Readings I often use as a starting point for a conversation. It sets a shared point of reference. I think there's also sort of a bigger picture, not just within the professional development that one is leading, but within the field. I think we struggle to create and embrace a field-wide literature. It's hard to find time to write. And so by incorporating readings into our professional development, one of the things that we're doing is helping to create and identify a field-wide literature. What are the important things that museum educators should be reading? And then people have that in their toolbox and on their bookshelf, and they refer back to it and can make more deliberate choices because they know what's out there, not just what you've told them, but what the field knows. So those are a few reasons.
Great, thanks. Over to you, Mark.
Great, thank you, David. My name is Mark Osterman. I'm the Guiding Programs Manager here at Vizcaya Museum and Gardens. Here at Vizcaya, we have a hybrid model where I have about 30 active volunteer guides and 6 part-time museum educators whom I work with and I train. Those two audiences will get, I think, into a little deeper as we continue the presentation, but they do require different approaches, different latitude, and different levels of depth in terms of the training process. But there are certain readings that I do use across the board. And in terms of why I use the readings, and excuse me for looking down every so often, I'm just referencing some notes. But I have sort of 3 key areas of why I incorporate readings into our trainings. One is to look at specific approaches to learning. So in our case, using particular readings to introduce our guides and museum educators to the theories of material culture studies, object-based learning. We use readings. A second purpose would be to introduce specific strategies. In this case, sort of the focus of where we are here, which is inquiry-based learning. Here at Vizcaya, we incorporate that into all of our tours, and so, by example, all of our training and continuing education. And the third purpose to the readings I choose is to introduce the field as an actual profession that's reflective in its practice. So one of those readings is the EdCom Excellence in Practice brochure, which kind of lays out these concepts through accessibility, accountability, and advocacy. So those are kind of the 3 core areas where it's sort of theory, specific strategy or methods, and the idea of the field of education and reflective practice.
Great. Thank you, Mark. Chris.
So I was very happy to be part of this conversation. I'm someone that constantly spends her time reading and thinking, how can this article be of relevance to my team or audiences primarily. I'm the education curator for the Museum of Contemporary Art in San Diego, and prior to that, I was at the new museum in New York and at MoMA in the K through 12 family programming audience divisions for those institutions and school programming. At the new museum, I started the new museum's docent volunteer program, who was responsible for guiding our school program experience and public tours. And here at MCA, I'm responsible for overseeing all our programming, but closely work with our team of part-time educators who serve all our audiences, K through 12 public programs and adult programming. And for all audiences, we based our programming in inquiry. And I think one essential part of reading is that once you read an article, a book, you're always posing questions. So to me, presenting these possibilities to my team is for them to what is the question that may arise from this conversation? What can we reflect on? How is this author sharing some insight to the work we do on a daily basis? And it doesn't necessarily have to be pedagogy readings. I tend to broaden the scope, and it might be anything from a Wall Street Journal article that talks about museums and their audiences and how are they experiencing museums, to something more specific. And certainly, again, as Mark, I want to highlight the work that our colleagues do in the field and how we are reflecting on our own practice.
Great. Thank you. So to get the ball rolling, I thought it would be interesting to think about, and for those of you who are listening, we will, as Michelle mentioned, we'll be sharing a shared Google Doc with a list of readings that we have chosen to recommend. But before we get there, I thought it would be interesting to think a little bit about the qualities of some of those readings. Like you, Chris, I'm always on the lookout for something new to bring to my team, and I've tried readings sometimes that fall completely flat, and I've tried readings that folks are still talking about. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on what are the qualities of a reading that makes it a good resource for helping train others. And that's for anybody who wants to jump in.
I've noticed that sometimes the readings I choose are also readings that have sparked a conversation among other colleagues and staff, whether it's my director sharing an article with me, or my peers, or even my family reading something on the paper and sharing it. It's like if someone that is slightly outside my daily job is bringing it to my attention, it was because it was relevant and it was interesting to them, and it was written in a way that sparked some thinking. So I tend to read those and then treat it very much like a book club. I really like including readings in our trainings, like the book club format, where you share the reading ahead of time, have people read sections, not very long, maybe not a whole book, maybe a team is responsible for a chapter, and reflect on that process. And then when it comes to training, we start our training, whether it's going to be content training or other specific training, with that half an hour of book club conversation. And then from there we can try to finesse it, and it's like, is there something here that we can transform into more formal training?
Yeah, something I struggle with is that balance between readings that are very practical and logistical and readings that are a little more abstract, or a little more, that require a longer time to think about and connect to the work that we actually do in the galleries. Sometimes one of them works, sometimes the other one does.
And sometimes there are readings that you keep coming back to, which is nice to have. I would say that whether it's practical or theoretical, it's nice for readings to have a very clear perspective. They're arguing for a way of doing things. I find that I rarely assign. I loved Elliot Kaiki's chapter in the book he wrote with Rika about the history of museum education, but I didn't assign that because really in a training situation it's much more readings that put out strategies that I find are most useful. And I think it's worth mentioning length. Chris talked about length. There are some great books out there, but there's no one chapter that would be the 1 or 2 chapters that you would assign. And in the training context, it is great to have something that is no longer than an article or a chapter, which is too bad because, again, there are great books out there.
Yeah, I think about some of the readings I came across in my graduate work that I love deeply and passionately, but that may not actually be the right choice for helping others think about how to use inquiry in the galleries.
Yeah.
I just wanted to chime in. Again, I think this also often has to do with, obviously, who your audience is. I mean, I have a challenge with my volunteer guides in terms of the types of articles and the content that I can give them to read. They have more of an interest in objective, historical fact and information as opposed to theory and strategy. Also on that note, though my volunteers are extremely dedicated to the museum, it's always difficult for me to engage what their dedication is to our choice of inquiry-based learning and what their full understanding is of that. So when I'm training my paid staff, they are approaching it in a different way, I guess sort of less opinionated. And they are also just the dynamics. My paid staff are in their early 20s. My volunteer guides are mainly 50 and over. And I don't like to characterize or stereotype too often, but there's a different level of adaptability and openness between those demographics.
Yeah, good teaching definitely means be keeping your audience first and foremost in mind. Yeah, Rebecca.
Well, I think I'm jumping to your next question, David. Sorry, but just thinking about sort of what Mark is saying, I think part of the issue is how do you contextualize the readings too. And sometimes I'll put out a reading and I can't get people in. The engagement has to do with also the context in which you present it, and one of the things that I struggle with, that this is just making me think about, is whether readings are best assigned before or after a session. Yeah. And to me, it resembles the problem of when do you give information in a tour? Because often, especially early in training, I like to elicit ideas from the trainees, from the people who are learning, and then support it with reading afterwards. But I'm not entirely sure those ever get read. Whereas if I'm assigning a reading that says sort of this is how you do it, then it's very the session becomes very didactic and it becomes less open. And in a way, one of the most useful types of readings to read beforehand are readings that I disagree with or are very provocative. So Rika Burnham's chapter about don't use questions, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the actual name of the chapter, but her chapter 6 of her book, which challenges using questions, I know I have it here right here as well, David, is great because I don't know that I agree with it, but she makes some great points. And so that's the book club format that Chris sort of referred to. So I think there's a lot of, the readings become very, very different in the different contexts. It's almost like we're not talking about one thing. We're talking about multiple ways of teaching. I
found when I'm training, to Mark, to your earlier point about sort of the different folks we train, I find when I'm training young folks, especially interns, to use inquiry, that I often have to make clear that I don't want them to agree with every reading I'm giving them. I'm giving them these things in order to get the wheels turning, but the goal is not agreement necessarily.
I think that's important. That leads towards active engagement in the training.
Yeah.
Yeah. And hopefully in some way models the inquiry approach we're going for in the galleries. That I've been thinking a lot in my own practice about the importance of dissent in a group and how you make room for respectful disagreement in a group and how that actually plays out, both in the process of inquiry when we're teaching and in the process of training folks for inquiry.
On that note, I mean, something that I'm interested in and I try to cull from certain readings and training, I mean, this idea of dissent is a little different, but also the idea that interpretation is fluid. So this idea that, you know, the interpretation of an object or a painting, what have you, is based on so many factors: how the museum values it, how it's contextualized within an exhibition, the knowledge base of whomever that interpreter is. But just sort of instilling within the interpreter, the person whom I'm training, that they're not a cipher. And even if they're acting as a facilitator, where that conversation goes and what's pulled from it, it can change. You know, it changes in time and in history, and it can even change on a daily basis. And I think that's important, and there's something exciting about that idea. I mean, that is why what we have, the environments we work in, are so amazing for learning and for teaching, is because of that fluidity, you know, to meaning, multiple interpretation and possibilities.
I also think about the time that inquiry takes, and the role of time both in the practice of investigating an object and the role of time in training people to think about that. Lately, I've been talking a lot about how this is a marathon, not a sprint.
Right.
So if a reading is challenging, or if you disagree with it, or if you don't quite understand it, let it try. I'm trying to think of what ways to let it sit, let it marinate, and then revisit it, if possible. And I haven't quite figured out how to do that effectively yet.
Yeah, David, there's a question that's up that I'd love to address.
Great. Yeah. Which one's pulling here?
How do you? Oh, it just moved. How do you move from open-ended disagreement regarding readings to maintaining certain standards or guidelines for interpretation and tour strategies?
Yeah.
I guess I wanted to address that not because I am convinced that I have a specific answer, as much as I think it's something that's a really important question that we all struggle with. And I would say one of the things that readings do is present that there are multiple correct ways to do something. So, for example, once you establish a sort of theoretical space in which you're working. For example, all of our tours here are inquiry-based, and here's what we mean by inquiry. We mean that questions are truly open, and that you're going to learn from the listener as well, I mean, from the participant, and not just provide all the answers. Then these readings provide different ways in. And along those lines also, when we're talking about training, I think we're all referring to meetings where we get together, but I think it's equally important to think about training as an ongoing mentorship. And part of how one can use readings is to have a bookshelf of these. And when someone says, you know, I'm really thinking that the kids on my tour seem to be thinking about these things, and I'm really fascinated by how 8-year-olds think, there might be developmental books that you can refer them to and then continue that discussion, and then they contribute to the group's learning. And that's as important to use for literature in training as everybody reads, you know, a Ron Richard article. Or
yeah.
I had a comment about that question as well, which is specifically thinking about if we're talking about inquiry-based training, is that, you know, the way you keep open-ended disagreement, you know, how you maintain standards or guidelines is that open-ended disagreement is your standard or guideline going through the inquiry-based process, if that makes sense.
Yeah, you're talking about using the method to teach the method.
Right. Right.
Chris, did you want to say something? Sorry, it looked like you were.
Yeah, I was kind of pondering on that same.
you had that look
of allowing that disagreement to be a part of the learning, but also knowing that, as Rebecca was mentioning, there's a way to address the fact that everybody who's in your team, whether they're volunteers or paid staff, had made a commitment to your approach. I know that many of our volunteers have transitioned.
Yeah, and getting that buy-in is so key.
But also like the idea of acknowledging that many of them have seen our field evolved. Many have started volunteering at times where lecturing was the cup of tea for everybody, and they've had to move on and adapt, and adaptability is not that easy for all of us, but just sort of recognizing that history in museum education and making them aware that they're part of this history, that they're part of changing the field, and while they're open to, like, they might feel more keen to lecturing style, more one voice approach, there's been a lot of progress and change through inquiry, and there's data to support that learning in that format is being rewarded by our visitors. So I think working with them in that sense and making them aware of their valuable role in the process, I think is also part of what we do with the mentoring that Rebecca was mentioning.
Yeah. It's interesting, the next question on the list with 3 votes, have you formulated an educational philosophy either personally or for your education department? Did you share it with your educational volunteers? This one I feel like flows nicely from the question that struck Rebecca in terms of, well, in some ways I would say one of the ways I try to help the volunteers I work with come to that respectful disagreement but eventually converge to some ideas is trying to come up with a clearly articulated philosophy or pedagogy that we can all agree on regardless of the various approaches we take to it. Here at the Met we do have a set of 10 gallery teaching goals that were developed collaboratively by educators, curators, conservators, and volunteers together. And they're extremely helpful for using as sort of benchmarks of, well, what you talked about there may not have been the exact style of teaching we were going for, but I can see why you were going for it because of this, that, and the other, that they're broad enough philosophical goals that they allow different approaches to different ways to get to success. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
There's an interesting tension in the language here between educational philosophy and goals that just got conflated, and I'm not sure if they're the same or different. I'm sort of thinking as I'm talking. But I do think that I agree, David, that is a way to keep people, even though they have dissent and variety in their forms of teaching, all doing the kind of work that you want to see in your galleries is by having clear goals. So if one of your goals is that people will think critically, that doesn't allow for lecture style because you can't see people thinking critically, whereas you can, that requires conversational engagement. So I certainly would say I always formulate educational goals, but I don't know that I need everybody to share my educational philosophy. That's part of what I'm grappling with right now. What's the difference? Dana, what's the difference?
Any other thoughts from the panel about Dana's question? Well, Dana, perhaps.
That's a very good question. I'm not sure if there is a difference. I mean, a goal feels objective and a philosophy feels a bit more out there and sometimes unattainable. But I mean, for us here at Vizcaya, it's incredibly important. We have an established learning division philosophy. It is shared. It does drive our ideas and our training. I can share, it's just like 6 bullets really quick. So our philosophy, we respond to the needs of diverse constituent communities, support active and social learning, empower visitors to make personal and meaningful connections with Vizcaya, present multiple entry points and perspectives for understanding Vizcaya, demonstrate excellence in content, learning theory, and practice, encourage new ways of thinking, and promote lifelong learning. So I mean, that kind of ties in like the strategies we want. It ties in the theories that we're interested in. It sort of captures everything, and we're able to go back to it and ground not our demands, but maybe our demands in that list of philosophies. It's very useful for us to share that with our volunteers and our museum institutes.
Mark, you're opening a whole can of vocabulary worms, too, because when I think about goals, I think about students' will or visitors' will, as opposed to the institution will. Sure. And I guess one can use the language both ways, but when I just want to, I guess, clarify that when I was saying that I think that goals can help narrow the choices that people have, I guess, and strategies, and still allow for debate. I think it's that works most effectively, at least for me, when those goals are. Sorry, I'm getting an echo in here. But anyway, sorry. It works most effectively for me when those goals are the goals for visitors, so that you can actually see if it's happening or not. And then there's another set of sort of institutional priorities. But again, I don't know what. I think everybody has different language that they use, and that is, again, back to the literature. I think one of the challenges in our field, and one of the things that hopefully by reading we can start to come to agreement about what language means.
So just to clarify this conversation, because Dana was clarifying a little bit more, she gave an example of if you apply for a faculty position, you have to articulate a philosophy and how it informs your pedagogical strategies. So she's starting to tease it out a little bit more there. But you bring up a good point, Rebecca, where are we talking about the institution's philosophy, your own personal philosophy, and then those are then informing your goals, but then also clearly affect which strategies you're going to be using. And then who holds you accountable for that as well is an interesting question.
And similar to Dana's thinking, I think in the case of my team, I do ask a similar question to, like, what's your teaching philosophy or your teaching strategies for the people I hire in my team? And I see those as personal philosophies. I want to be able to know where these individuals stand in terms of learning and students and classroom management, and like what are their approaches? How do they move in the realm of teaching and learning? And then we also have what I call the MCA's, the gallery teaching strategies, and that outlines the backbone of inquiry learning for us, like starting from the visual and going into the interpretive and then connecting to content, and really outlining both for our team and our partnering teachers who engage in then self-guiding their own school groups, a structure that tells them how to move from there. And these are all based on many years of readings and approaching our own teaching languages and methodologies by many of our colleagues and peers and mentors in the field that just had to be synthesized so that we're all speaking the same language within our team, within our group, and can understand each other. So I do agree that our literature and our strategies and outlining people's philosophy allows us to at least recognize if we're in the same boat or not.
Yeah, to that larger point, thinking back to our earlier question about the qualities of a good reading for training, I think about readings that help the people I train articulate for themselves what these strategies look like when we use them. They might use words different than I would, but if I can understand what they're saying about inquiry, then I feel successful, even though they might be doing it differently. And I think maybe this would be a good pivot point in the conversation to think about some of these readings themselves, and to look at this list of readings that the panel has organized, and to share it with everybody who's listening.
I just want to note also that there's one question getting a lot of attention, so yes. I do want to get to that after. I think it's important to look at the readings now, I completely agree, but then we should address this question about, go back to this philosophy question.
Yeah, I think so too.
So
honestly, we'll probably be able to integrate that question into many of the things we're going to be talking about in our readings.
So if you look on our Google Hangout event page right now, I just posted a link to a living document. It's a Google document where you can see a list of resources that the panel has suggested, and then it's open for edit, so you can contribute your own ideas or add on or even build on the rationale that some of us have already started for some of those readings. But I wasn't sure if someone wanted to highlight one or two resources that you put on the list.
I think it's worth pointing out that several folks on the panel have talked about Rika Burnham and Elliot Kaiki's work in several different ways, and I'm sure many of our listeners are familiar with those works too. So I'll I'll point out that at the top of the list, the classic "if you don't stop, you don't see anything" article, I've seen it used countless times by countless different people, and it's still a good one. It's got many of the qualities that we talked about. It's succinct. It offers some very practical examples that backs up some very abstract ideas. And I like the way that even though it's a short article, I found that it often helps me, to Chris's idea about the book club, it helps me actually spark a conversation that can last for half an hour if I let it.
Yeah. I want to note on the list that I'm sorry, did you want to talk first, Mark? Okay, no. That most of these are museum education literature, but there's a couple that are from outside of our field that are, I find it very valuable to go to literature that is from not just the education field, but the cognitive psychology field. One person who's not on this list who I look at his writing a lot is Daniel Willingham, who's a cognitive psychologist. But on here specifically, Neil Postman and Charles Weingartner's Teaching as a Subversive Activity, which is the best title of a book ever. And they have a whole chapter about the inquiry method, and they're really thinking about sort of its importance. So it sort of contextualizes it. So I'm sure there are other resources that we're all missing, you know, that if people can add to this list, that we could gather these resources that are from fields that are too large for any of us to inherently know all the literature.
Yeah, and for those of you who are listening, we really would encourage you to add your ideas to the bottom of that list so it can continue to grow. These few choices that the panel added were just starting points.
I was just going to mention quickly, I mean, we have a huge list of reading materials, but I mean, one of the articles I listed, which is Understanding the Basics through VTS, is I utilize that for the transferable skills of the role of the facilitator and how to facilitate a discussion. And that is often very challenging for, well, actually for anyone, whether it's our museum educators or our volunteer guides, to really understand what that role is and how to really drive a conversation. Mm-hmm. It's an incredible skill, and it's something that we kind of cull from there. We don't practice, per se, VTS here at the museum, but we try to cull the questioning strategies that incorporate, and specifically the facilitator behaviors that are grounded in VTS. So that short article helps us use as a springboard to then model facilitation skills throughout the galleries.
And I just want to note that somebody had added as a comment how important modeling was, and I just want to reinforce that readings are supplementary, but actually modeling and having educators model other strategies is not something you can skip in a training.
Yeah, no.
And I just wanted to point out, I ended up contributing quite a few just blogs and web-based resources just because I've been finding a lot of these blogs are posting really interesting questions that colleagues are trying out innovative techniques or really questioning why we do what we do or how we work with certain audiences, and that's actually been really helpful as we start figuring out how we might want to shape or refine what we're doing with particular audiences. And it's also helpful if working with K-12 audiences to look at what they're grappling with as an audience. So I frequently will refer, particularly those that are entering into the field, to look at just something like Education Week that highlights different things, especially as very big policy decisions are being made right now. So it's just helpful for gallery educators to just be aware of what those audiences are working with right now.
Chris, did you want to mention or highlight any of the readings you added to the list?
I added quite a few, and as Rebecca, as you mentioned, we shared that to Elliot and Kaiki and Rika Berman's articles, that I included a book that's slightly outside our field just because I feel it's a general public read, and it's a good winter or summer read, which is Museum Legs by Amy Whitaker. And one of the reasons why I've included a couple of the chapters in that book into our book club reflection training sessions with my team is because it speaks from the visitor's point of view. And I think that book gives my team kind of an insight on who's this young demographic coming to a contemporary art museum, what's happening when things are being kind of, we want to drive audience under concepts like cocktails in art. These many happenings that museums are presenting to audiences today, and where do we sit as educators? Who are those visitors? How is my mother different than anyone else in the audience or the public that we're trying to serve? Because I think we spend a lot of time training our teams into, well, what's good pedagogy for K through 12, and how do general public audiences understand museums, and how do we share content that curators want to bring across? But we spend very little time thinking about who those audiences are. And I think she gives us a very fun and light-hearted perspective on who that visitor might be. That has made my team really stop and think, oh, this is who we're talking about. Oh, that's not so strange that someone is not nodding during my tour, or why are they all on their phones? Kind of perspective. And it's made us stop and see, well, what in this reading as a team can we do? Are there some ideas or suggestions in our own teaching that could address issues presented by this utopian visitor?
Yeah.
So I find it, and it was something that I gave as a Christmas gift 2 years ago to my team, and I still have copies to give to new members in our team, and they all kind of came back raving, which was very, I knew they were going to like it, but I feel like they took now that book club format a little bit more serious, that it's not just readings for learning and teaching per se, that it's reading for thinking.
Yeah, and for thinking critically about what you're thinking about, to get too meta.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I see Cami has asked a question. What do you think are the essential tools for a staff's inquiry toolbox? And I wonder if that might be an interesting way to talk through some of the other readings we've added to that list.
Can I just, David, before we switch questions,
Oh,
the other
yeah,
question
please.
that was up there about whether we share our philosophies with other
Oh,
people
yes,
in our
thank you for
museum.
that. Sorry, there's a lot of information all at once.
Yeah, no, it's a little baffling to try to go back and forth with the Google Doc and the questions. And but I did want to note that all of these readings that we're suggesting are about inquiry, and that one of the things that I've been sort of thinking a lot about on the blog Museum Questions is the goals that people are articulating for, and this is school tours, and I know a lot of what we're talking about here is school tours, but I think this applies to adult tours as well, is that what we are valuing here is inquiry and engagement, and our goals have less and less to do with information transmission. And so I think it's a very important question to ask about the other departments in the museum, and whether this is an education-specific discussion that we think that the visitor experience is about engagement and thinking and feeling, or museums in marketing and sort of directors give a lot of lip service these days to engagement, and how much of that is marketing and how much are we all on the same page as to visitor engagement. Anyway, and I think this is important to understand what our own goals are and why we're making the choices that we're making, and to be able to really advocate for them museum-wide. Because I suspect that especially in large art museums, everybody's not on that same page.
As somebody who works in one of those large museums, I can confirm that there are many different ways of thinking about what should and should not happen in the galleries. It's one reason I think why it's so important to have that. Somebody mentioned earlier their personal philosophies, and I think the question, Rebecca, I'm sorry it's no longer on my screen, but this idea of whether your personal philosophy is reflected by your institution, or reflected isn't the word, but does your personal philosophy and your institution's philosophy connect in a meaningful way. I'd say yes, here, we're lucky to have that, but the struggle is, to Chris's point, it's about helping people articulate that for themselves in ways that somebody else can then understand and do something with.
I just wanted to point out really quickly, a couple folks were typing in that they had trouble accessing the Google Docs, so I have that posted, that that link was posted here in the Q&A a couple different times. This is just a reminder, if you RSVP, which means that you need to have a Google Plus account, you will have access to these different things as an advantage of being a Google Plus member. So I highly encourage, it's free to open up a Google Plus account, and then that would enable you to have access to these different links as we go through the Hangouts live. We can also post it again on our Google Plus page at the end of the Hangout. So I just wanted to chime in with that quick detail.
Definitely. I also will note that the current doc seems to have 48 total viewers. I don't know how many people can log into it at once, so it may be a like save that link and check back in an hour kind of situation.
So the question that I took down just so we could have the link up was, the other thing was what you all consider to be essential for the inquiry toolbox for educators, or as you're training educators or volunteers. I didn't know if anyone wanted to chime in with an answer to that question.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I think is essential is flexibility. And, you know, it's not exactly something you can teach, but you can give examples and you can spark those ideas. And I find, for instance, the fourth book, the fourth reading that I suggested on that list, it's by John Hennigar-Schue, and it's called Teaching Yourself to Teach with Objects. It's a wonderful and very informal way of thinking about what flexibility looks like when you're working with people. He talks about, at one point, he's on the road, as many of us are when we're off-site teaching, and he brings his car to a garage, and it's full of animal skulls that he was using as teaching objects. And the people at the gas station become deeply fascinated by these animal skulls, and it leads to a spontaneous inquiry in the gas station about animal adaptations. And it's always a nice turning point for me to help visitors, or to help the folks I train, think about being really receptive to questions and to those moments where people express curiosity, and the importance of being flexible enough to value that curiosity and pursue it. So that's one, I would say, essential item to an inquiry toolbox.
For me, an essential item would really go back to what I mentioned earlier about facilitation skills. I mean, I've observed many times, excuse me, a really well-crafted, open-ended question just not used well, you know, because the interpreter asking that question wasn't playing the role of an active listener, wasn't utilizing, you know, wasn't remaining neutral or utilizing paraphrasing to acknowledge people and drive discourse. So there's a whole series of skills involved in how you can take what for one person might be a very brief conversation that can be turned into something that gets a lot more depth from careful active listening, and honestly from a lot of the skills that we here call from VTS practice in terms of the role of the facilitator.
Other thoughts from the panel on key essential inquiry toolbox?
I just wanted to point out the Gardner Museum also uses VTS quite actively, particularly with the school partnership program, and it's not our main pedagogy as a department, but it definitely informs a lot of our work, so kind of similar to what Mark was talking about. But for the school partnership program, both in terms of training you know, staff that join our teaching team here, but also with training classroom teachers, because that's our primary audience who we're training to lead those discussions. We have created a couple different videos that show what those different inquiry-based discussions look like using VTS, and it's been really helpful because in the past most of our videos were focusing on elementary, and we recently just posted one with high school. So that's been really helpful because that's an audience that hasn't really been documented in that way. So I know that that's helpful, but it's also, I was going to say, because someone was asking, I'm gonna pick up the question about videos or podcasts that we could recommend for training purposes. The other thing is that if you have a staff, even if you're just a department of one in terms of education, grab a couple of colleagues and go into the galleries and have a conversation and then talk about it. And I think that would address some of the things that Rebecca was talking about in terms of institutional lens or understanding of what we're trying to accomplish in terms of engaging certain audiences. And the more that we can go and activate ourselves with the artwork and have those interactions, I think would also spread that understanding both internally, but then also help you think about how you're engaging the audiences that you work with too.
I would say in terms of our own reading too, I think that, well, for the video and podcast question, I was just thinking there's a couple of interesting videos online by Stephen Chu, C-H-E-W, who's a cognitive psychologist, about how people learn. And I think that if we're going to be advocates for this type of teaching, we need to do our own reading about, many of us have already, but about how people learn. Because it's not just that it leads to an enjoyable gallery discussion, although I think I agree with Michelle, in experiencing that is important. But it has to do with what we know based on science, what people will take away with them.
And kind of building on what you were just saying though, Rebecca, it was reminding me, are there specific readings that any of you use to point out the outcomes that you're looking for in the audiences when you're using inquiry-based teaching? I was curious about that because a lot of the readings that we've been mentioning are more about the methodology or how to go about approaching it, or how to go about the teaching. But I'm curious how you help a docent or a staff member know that that teaching was successful, especially if they're still learning what inquiry-based looks like.
No, go for
sorry.
it. Go for it.
And I see it on our Hangout, on our resource list, the teaching in the, I'm going to butcher this, artmuseumteaching.com blog. Tend to refer my team a lot to that blog, primarily because it presents a lot of, not successful, but I would say next practice results. It's a very clear voice of what our colleagues are doing around the country and what they define as next step practice or successful practice, or even question their own practice. I think it's such a interesting, reflective blog that gives our team for like everything from working with teens to conversations in the gallery, a perspective of, oh, well, if the rest of the country is on this, and if I'm hearing that at the Met they're doing that, and at MoMA they're doing that, and they seem very similar to what we're trying to do, we might be on the same track. It might look slightly different for San Diego, but I feel like a lot of our museum educators and volunteers do see other institutions as models for education and teaching, and referring them to the work that our colleagues are doing has been at least very successful for our team. They now seek that type of learning on their own, and some of them might have the opportunities to travel to the East Coast, and then they come back and share something that happened on a tour or a brochure that they picked up at a gallery in the East Coast, and we all kind of continue to learn from that process. Going back to the toolbox question, I do think that Rika and Elliot's book is a book that should be in every educator's bookshelf. And whether you take the time to read it all at once and go back to it many times, or select a chapter that you're most interested in, or even a quote that responds to what you're trying to train at the moment, you should give the opportunity for your team to have it. I think that sense of that people can own the knowledge sometimes is quite important. A book that I didn't put on my list, but that comes to mind in sense of sharing how does good teaching looks like, is a book that is just recently published by Stuart Grauer, who's the founder of the Grauer School here in Encinitas, and it's a big advocate for small school teaching. And he has a chapter on, the book is called Real Teachers, True Stories of Renegade Educators. And one of the chapters is of him visiting the Frick and like coming to terms with a painting and thinking about Rembrandt in terms of him being a teacher, and what did that look like, and having a school and a set of apprentices. And it's a very short chapter, but the whole journey of the author encountering an artwork, reflecting on that perspective, thinking about the artist as a teacher, just has broadened my perspective on what I want my team to ultimately have as an outcome. This very possibility of people pondering beyond the 30, 45-minute conversation that sheds light on an artwork, from its very basic structure to the possibility of what was the context of this artist? Why are we having this exhibition at this time and age at this particular institution? Who made this loan agreement possible? Those broader conversations, I think, are good things to consider as interesting outcomes of what good inquiry could be, that there's still questions happening. I think it's always hard to cut a tour short, but sometimes that shows to the success of, like, go have those conversations outside with your colleagues, with anyone else. It's what I would consider that talks about inquiry in a very broad way.
Yeah.
You can continue to ask questions.
I'd also add that regardless of your personal or your institutional approach to VTS, to visual thinking strategies, their website has some fantastic video footage of students in inquiry with teachers and artworks right there, with all the messy, frayed edges that comes with that. And it's I find those can be really helpful teaching tools as well.
One other thing to think about as a resource, if you want to think about sort of responding to Michelle's question, is to think about what do we mean by interpretation. And Terry Barrett has a great book about interpretation that's useful.
Great. So we're coming up on the last 2 to 3 minutes, so any last thoughts from the panel before we wrap up?
I would just say I think it's really, I'm grateful to everybody for their questions and their participation. It's really awesome to go to that resource list and see all those little colorful boxes. How many people are hungry for this sort of thing? So I would just say let's leave that document open and live and continue adding to it after this conversation is over, because I'd love to hear what other tools people are using. Other thoughts from the panel? And
I can also work with NAEA, and we can post that on the Museum Education Division page, so that there's a link there as well, along with the rest of the Hangout information.
Great. So maybe if you're listening and you've got ideas to add to that list, maybe add them by the end of this week, and then we'll take what we've got and put it into something that we can share with everybody.
Great.
Thank you all. I think it's great to be in this very reflective conversation and inviting others to consider reading as a way of a reflecting museum education practice.
Great question.
And Michelle, thank you for organizing these peer-to-peer sessions. They're a really wonderful way for us to connect and just delve into our profession.
Great. No, thank you all for contributing too, and it's so great to start with not only sharing our ideas here, but then having dialogue with viewers, but then also having this Google document that David started. So it'll be a great resource, I think, for the field, especially as we're all thinking about teaching and learning. So thank you. So just to wrap up, thank you again for joining us for another peer-to-peer hangout on behalf of NAEA's Museum Education Division. Next month, our next hangout will be featuring early childhood programs, and that'll take place on Wednesday, February 11th at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And also just a quick reminder, there's still time to sign up for the NAEA annual convention, which is taking place in New Orleans at the end of March. So we hope that you will continue joining us both online and also to connect in person when we see you hopefully in March. So thank you all again for sharing your ideas, and we'll see you soon. Okay.
Thank you, Michelle.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Bye.
Rebecca.
Bye.